Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to this series in which we're discussing the purpose of life, why we're created, why we're sent here, what is it we're supposed to be doing here in this life, and where are we heading towards. We already mentioned in this series that the number one primary, most important purpose that we were created for is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we're looking at different aspects of this ubudiyya or slavehood to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we'll be discussing other purposes as well after we discuss this important or primary purpose, which is worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There are other purposes like following the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam and walking the straight path, the Siratul Mustaqim, walking along or journeying along the straight path. We'll be discussing those purposes as well. But we're on now discussion around ubudiyya, slavehood to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how we become people who surrender to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One aspect to discuss is what is the criteria for acceptance of our ibadah, of our worship. What are the most important criteria for everything has a criteria. You can't just do things without knowing the conditions. So there are two criteria for the acceptability, for the validity of our ibadah, of our ubudiyya, of our slavehood to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, any action we do, hoping that this is counted as worship, as ibadah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there are two conditions we must fulfill. One is intention, a niyyah, right? Intention must be sincerely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is ikhlas, purity of intention. The second criteria is that all worship that we do, the worship that we do, especially the formal worship that we do, must be in accordance to the guidance of Sharia, must be in accordance to the Quran and the Sunnah, the way of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, especially in formal ritual ibadah. So today's show will be discussing, inshallah, these two, and if we get time, perhaps we'll add one or two other criterias. The first one of intention, this is critical for us. This is absolutely of the highest importance. People could be praying salah, they could be going hajj, they could be fasting, they could be paying zakat, they could be paying charity, sadaqah, fi sabilillah, and none of this may be accepted. None of this, all of this could go to waste. Based on what? Based on if they're not doing it sincerely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're told about on the Day of Judgment, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam informs us about, about the first three people who will be raised up on the Day of Judgment and questioned about what they did for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we know this is the famous narration about, one person, he will be questioned. What did you do with whatever I gave you of blessings? I blessed you with so many things. What did you do for my sake? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will ask this person. And, this person will say, you gave me knowledge. I taught people day and night. I taught people. You gave me knowledge. I was a alim. I was a scholar. And this is what I did for your sake. This is what I did in your path. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will say that no, those actions you did of teaching and guiding people, you did this not for my sake. You did it so that people call you a big scholar, or they call you a scholar, an alim, so they recognize you. So you did it for your own fame and name, not for my sake. Meaning this person's intention wasn't pure. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserve us from that. And this person will be ordered to be dragged into the hellfire. Similarly with another two people. They will be asked, one of them will say, I was given a lot of wealth and I spent this in your path. I spent this for the sake of Islam. I spent it for good causes. I spent it feeding, the poor and charitable causes. You see a lot of people donate in charity and they tell people this is how much I donated, or People get to know about their generosity, or they're well known to be charitable, to be generous for the sake of Allah. But this person will be raised up and asked, and he will say, you gave me wealth, I spent it for your sake, in your path. This is what I did for you. And similar to the first person, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will say, no, you did this so people call you generous. You did it to show people. You did it for your own fame, so that people say you are a generous man. You didn't do it for my pleasure. You didn't have meaning, you didn't have pure intention. So again, we see here that the intention wasn't there, and no matter how much you donate, it's going to be wasted. It's going to count for nothing. And this person is ordered into the hellfire. The third person is asked the same question. This person says, I gave my life for your sake. I fought defending the Muslims. Jihad, fi sabilillah. I fought defending the Muslims. I was in battle most of the time. This is what I did for your sake. And I died as a shaheed. I died as a martyr. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will turn to him and say, no, you died as a martyr, so people will call you brave. People will call you shaheed. People will call you a martyr. This is why you did it, not for me. You didn't do it for my sake. And similarly, this person will be dragged into the hellfire. So imagine, just look at these three people's actions. They're some of the highest actions. Many of us can't do any of these three. Seeking knowledge and teaching it, or earning wealth and spending it for the sake of Allah, and then, or fighting or giving your wealth and life for the cause of truth and justice for Islam, etc. And these three people, who apparently on the outside looked as though they were doing some of the best deeds, but none of these three were accepted. Why? Because the intention wasn't correct. They didn't do it sincerely for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They had no ikhlas. So this is so important. This is the number one condition, the first criteria for any of us. If we want our actions to be accepted, if we want our actions to be accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if we want to see those deeds on the Day of Judgment being paid to us in reward, we must ensure that our actions are done for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is what ikhlas means. Ikhlas means to separate, to make single, to make pure your intention. You have a single intention. You have a pure intention. Nothing else is mixed in there. You're doing salah for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're spending money, charity, only for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, only to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're going to Hajj, not because people will call you Haji, not because you want people to call you Haji when you come back, Haji Sahab. Not because of that, no. You do it for that, you've lost your Hajj. You've lost your Hajj. You gain nothing from that Hajj. So you must be doing it for the sake of Allah. When you pray, when you fast, when you pay zakat, when you teach, when you do anything that can be called Islamic, when you do any act of ibadah, remember it must be purely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is not, it's easy on one sense. In one sense it's easy. You stay alert, you think, you reflect before you do the action. But it's not easy. Like some of our scholars said, that I spent many years perfecting my intention. Because every time, the Prophet ﷺ said this lesser shirk is called riya, to do actions, to do ibadah, to show other people. This is riya. This is like to do an action whereby you do it just for the show. You're showing other people and they see this action, and you become pleased when they think you're pious, or when they think you're generous, or when they think you're alim. This is a riya, and this is the lesser shirk, and the Prophet ﷺ said it's harder to detect than a black ant that's crawling on a black surface in the middle of a dark night. It's very difficult to detect this. It's something within the heart. It's something that comes in your mind. It's something subtle. You may make the intention, this is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You may make that intention in the beginning, but as soon as you start the action, or just before you start the action, you may be doing it for other people. That, shaitan will whisper, or that awareness of other people around you comes in, and then you divert your ibadah and you're actually doing it for them. So this is something we must guard ourselves against, and this is the first criteria for any of our ibadah, which is why we were created, to do ibadah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Our major, primary, most important purpose is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the first criteria, first condition for it to be accepted is intention and niyyah, and it has to be with ikhlas, it has to be pure, it has to be singular, only for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Inshallah, we'll continue the discussion after the break. Stay with us, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.